These teenagers sat quietly in an interrogation room, trying to keep their composure. Just hours earlier, they thought that everything was under control because no one was supposed to know what really happened. But now, detectives were asking questions. With every passing minute, the reality of the situation was sinking in, and for the first time, they were starting to realize that their life of freedom might already be over. This is the story behind the murder of Seath Jackson in Ocala, Florida, and how a group of teenagers slowly realized they had made a mistake they could never undo. Before his name became part of a shocking crime story, Seath Jackson was just a typical 15-year-old teenager growing up in Ocala, Florida. One of the most important parts of his life at the time was his relationship with Wright, which began in December 2010. At first, the relationship seemed like many other teenage romances. The two spent a lot of time together, talked frequently, and were known among their friends as a couple. For a while, things appeared normal as they enjoyed each other's company. But like many teenage romances, the relationship was intense and emotional. Over time, the excitement that once brought them together slowly began to fade. Disagreements started to appear more often, and small arguments sometimes grew into larger conflicts. By March 2011, the relationship had come to an end. The breakup was not a quiet one. Online arguments began to replace the excitement they once shared, and the tension between them became increasingly visible to people around them. Rumors began to circulate among classmates, and what had started as a teenage romance was now becoming something far more hostile. For Jackson, it was just another painful high school breakup, the kind many teenagers experience as they grow up. But what he didn't realize was that the tension surrounding that relationship was about to spiral into something far darker than anyone could have imagined. With time, more people gradually became involved in the conflict. At the center of it was Michael Bargo, who was 18 and had begun dating Wright shortly after her breakup with Jackson. According to friends and later accounts presented during the investigation, Bargo appeared to take the situation personally. His hostility toward Jackson became increasingly obvious, especially as he came to believe that Jackson had abused Wright during their relationship. Around them was a small group of friends and acquaintances who spent time together and were familiar with the ongoing tension. Among them were Kyle Hooper, Wright's 16-year-old brother, 20-year-old Justin Soto, and 18-year-old Charlie Ely. Hooper had once been a close friend of Jackson. However, that friendship deteriorated following Jackson's breakup with his sister. What had once been a friendly relationship between the two teenagers gradually turned into resentment, adding another layer of conflict to an already tense situation. During the final weeks before the murder, tensions between Michael Bargo and Seath Jackson continued to escalate, especially online. The two argued frequently, and according to later accounts, their exchanges became increasingly hostile. At times, the arguments involved direct threats. During one confrontation at Jackson's house, Bargo reportedly made a chilling remark, claiming that he had a bullet with Jackson's name on it. As the days passed, the situation did not calm down. Instead, the anger surrounding Jackson continued to build among the group. What may have initially been expressions of anger and frustration gradually shifted into discussions about confronting him directly. According to investigators, the group eventually discussed getting Jackson to a house where several of them were already gathered. The idea was that bringing him there would allow them to deal with the situation face to face. The one person who could make that happen was Amber. On April 17, 2011, Wright reached out to Seath Jackson and asked him to come over. She told him that they should talk and possibly settle the tension between them. The message suggested that they could clear the air after everything that had happened between them. Amber told him to meet her at a house in Summerfield where she was spending time with friends. To Jackson, the invitation may have sounded like a chance to resolve things after a difficult breakup. It was not unusual for former couples to meet and try to settle lingering arguments or misunderstandings, so he agreed. But when Jackson made the decision to go to the house, he had no way of knowing what was waiting for him there. Several people were already inside the home. Jackson believed he was walking into a conversation. In reality, the situation had already moved far beyond that. What had once started as a bitter teenage conflict was now moving toward a confrontation that would change all of their lives. When Seath Jackson arrived at the house, he stepped inside expecting to talk. Instead, he immediately found himself facing a confrontation. According to investigators, the situation turned violent within moments of his arrival. Kyle Hooper was the first to attack. Armed with a baseball bat, he struck Jackson during the sudden ambush. The assault happened quickly, leaving Jackson little time to react or defend himself. The attack escalated almost immediately. During the struggle that followed, Michael Bargo pulled out a handgun. He then fired multiple shots at Jackson. The violence unfolded in a matter of moments. By the time it was over, the meeting Jackson believed would be a conversation had turned into a deadly attack inside the home. In the hours that followed, the group faced a reality they had not fully prepared for. Seath Jackson was dead. The atmosphere inside the house quickly shifted from violence to panic as the teens tried to process what had just happened. The confrontation they had expected had turned into something far more serious. Now they were faced with the consequences of a crime none of them could undo. Jackson's body was placed inside a sleeping bag as the group tried to figure out what to do next. Instead of calling authorities or seeking help, they made arrangements to hide what had happened. They had believed that they might still be able to cover up the crime if they acted quickly. Investigators later said the teens attempted to destroy evidence by burning the body in a fire pit behind the house. The fire burned for hours as they tried to eliminate any trace of what had taken place inside the home. Afterward, the remains were gathered and placed into several containers, including paint buckets. On the morning of April 18, 2011, James Havens, the 37-year-old stepfather of Wright and Hooper, arrived at the house. According to investigators, he assisted the youths in disposing of Jackson's ashes. The containers holding the remains were then taken away from the house. The group later drove to a remote quarry outside of Ocala, Florida, where the remains were dumped in an attempt to conceal what had happened and distance themselves from the crime. For a brief moment, it may have seemed to them that their actions had erased the evidence, but despite their efforts to hide the crime, the truth would not stay buried for long. Later on April 18, 2011, Jackson's mother reported her son missing after realizing she had not heard from him and could not reach him since the previous day. At first, the disappearance created concern among family members and friends, but there was no immediate indication of what had actually happened. Meanwhile, for a short time, it seemed like the group believed the crime might never be discovered. But secrets like that are difficult to keep, especially among teenagers. Not long after the incident, word of what had happened began to slip out. At first, the claims sounded like rumors, stories that seemed too shocking and disturbing to believe. Those reports ultimately reached authorities. Investigators soon began questioning individuals connected to the group. Among the people they interviewed was Charlie Ely. During questioning, Ely eventually told investigators what had happened. Her statement provided the first clear account of the attack and the events that followed, giving detectives critical information that allowed them to begin piecing together the crime. The plan the group believed would stay hidden had begun to unravel. Once investigators had Eli's statement, the case moved quickly. Detectives began gathering evidence to confirm the details described during questioning. Search efforts soon led authorities to the quarry outside of Ocala, where they recovered burned remains connected to Seath Jackson. The discovery provided investigators with physical evidence that supported the statements they had received. At the same time, detectives examined phone records and digital messages exchanged between members of the group. Those records helped establish the timeline of events leading up to the meeting at the house and showed how communication between the teens had unfolded before and after the attack. Witness statements from people who knew the group added further context, describing the growing conflict and tension in the days leading up to the incident. As investigators combined the statements, phone records, and physical evidence, they were able to reconstruct what had happened during the night of the attack and the hours that followed. One by one, the people involved were taken into custody. Soon, All 5 suspects connected to the crime had been arrested, bringing the investigation into one of Ocala's most shocking crimes into the public eye. In the months and years that followed, the case moved slowly through the court system as investigators and prosecutors worked to build their cases against each person involved. Prosecutors argued that the attack on Seath Jackson had not been a random act of violence, but rather an event that had been planned and carried out by members of the group, with each individual playing a different role in the events that ultimately led to his death. As the legal proceedings unfolded, the courts began determining the responsibility of each person involved. The trials resulted in several convictions. On September 23, 2011, Charlie Ely was found guilty of first-degree murder by a Marion County jury, becoming the first of the 5 to be convicted for killing Seath Jackson. During the investigation and legal proceedings, Ely later cooperated with investigators and prosecutors. As part of that cooperation, she accepted a plea agreement and received a prison sentence. After serving part of that time, she was eventually released. Justin Soto, who helped dispose of the remains after the killing, became the second of the 5 to be convicted. In order to avoid the possibility of facing the death penalty, Soto chose to plead guilty to first-degree murder. On May 30, 2012, he was sentenced to life in prison for his role in the crime. Amber Wright, who had contacted Seath and arranged for him to come to the house, and Kyle Hooper, who carried out the initial attack with a baseball bat, later stood trial together for their roles in the murder. Their proceedings began on June 6, 2012, and were conducted before 2 separate juries, even though the trials took place simultaneously. After hearing the evidence presented in court, both juries reached their decisions. On June 12, 2012, Hooper and Wright were each found guilty of first-degree murder. Because both siblings were under the age of 18 when the murder was committed, they were not eligible for the death penalty under Florida law. However, they still faced the most severe sentence available for juveniles convicted of first-degree murder at the time, which was life in prison without the possibility of parole. Michael Bargo, identified by prosecutors as the gunman in the attack, was the last of the 5 main perpetrators to stand trial. On August 20, 2013, he was convicted of first-degree murder for his role in the killing of Seath Jackson. Initially, Bargo received the death penalty following his conviction. However, after changes to Florida's death penalty laws in the years that followed, that sentence was later overturned. He was eventually resentenced to life in prison instead. Bargo was the final member of the group to be convicted of murdering Jackson. Another individual connected to the case, James Havens, was also charged in relation to the crime. In 2014, he was initially ruled mentally incompetent to stand trial, which delayed the legal process. Years later, in 2018, Havens eventually pleaded guilty to his role as an accessory to first-degree murder. As a result of that plea, he faced the maximum possible sentence of 30 years in prison. By the time the legal proceedings were finished, the case that began with a group of teenagers and a violent confrontation had led to multiple life sentences and decades in prison for those involved. What started as a conflict between teenagers had ultimately changed the lives of everyone connected to the case, permanently. The story of Seath Jackson is not just a tale of a crime. It is a warning about the consequences of choices, the weight of responsibility, and the fragility of trust.